Hi, I'm Stuart Malina, Music Director of the Greenwich Symphony Orchestra, and I'm here today to invite you to join us for our concerts on January 27th and 28th at the Performing Arts Center at Greenwich High School. Those of you who are interested in an in-depth discussion of the program, I ask you to watch the companion video to this one. But for the purposes of this video, I would like to give you a brief introduction to the three pieces we will be performing. The first comes from 1906, and it's by American composer Charles Ives. Charles Ives lived a life of relative obscurity in the world of music. During his life, his music was rarely performed, and many people didn't even know he existed. But late in his life, and certainly after his death, he came to be considered one of the most innovative and important American composers. The piece we're going to play is called The Unanswered Question, and in this he sets up three forces within the orchestra. The string section, which plays extremely quietly and extremely tonally throughout the piece, he describes as the silence of the Druids, who know, see, and hear nothing. Over this blanket of very soft chordal movement, the trumpet alone poses a musical question, which Ives calls the perennial question of existence. This is an atonal question, and it's answered several times. Each time the trumpet plays the same question, a woodwind quartet, two flutes, a clarinet, and an oboe answer the question, and as the piece progresses, the answers become more agitated, more argumentative, at times even mocking the question itself. Until finally, the final attempt at an answer is a crazed argument that ends in a shriek. This then disappears, and we're left with not just the question, but this beautiful chordal underpinning that we've been hearing all along, settling deep under the surface from the string section. I think it's a marvelous piece of music. It's extremely evocative, extremely interesting. But I also think that it very much applies to our lives today, where we're living lives, lives surrounded by arguments, surrounded by angry banter, people coming from opposite sides and not coming to any consensus, noise coming throughout the day from emails and cell calls and also social media. And I think that it's incumbent on us to search for the answer to this question. And I think in the end, the answer is the quiet that lies beneath the surface. I think it's a wonderful metaphor. I also think it's a wonderful piece of music with which we can open this concert. Speaking of wonderful pieces of music, the second piece on our program is Beethoven's glorious Violin Concerto. He only wrote one. And it is considered one of the great pieces of all time, certainly one of the most beloved violin concertos in the entire symphonic and concerto repertoire. It was written 100 years before Charles Ives wrote The Unanswered Question. In 1806, Beethoven was already at the full capacity of his great powers as a composer, changing the face of music. And with this piece, he really does change very much how composers would approach writing violin concertos. The concerto would suddenly become a much larger form. This is a substantially larger piece than, let's say, the Mozart violin concertos that came before. And it also is a lot more virtuosic, meaning that the violinist is not just playing beautiful melodies with the orchestra, but also, in a sense, demonstrating the skills of the player that are required. And as you get into the 19th century, we enter this age of the virtuoso, of people like Paganini, people like Franz Liszt, who redefined what was possible on an instrument. And Beethoven is beginning to scratch that surface, making this a much more comprehensively difficult piece to play. But overall, the most important thing to realize about this piece is it's just gloriously beautiful. From the from the opening strains of a solo timpani playing 4 solo notes, which opens up into this very beautiful and majestic opening movement, to the second movement, which is the polar opposite of absolute intimacy and quiet and lyricism and variation. Beethoven was one of the kings of variation, and we see this in the second movement, which is, in its basic sense, a simple set of theme and variations. But more than anything, it is a much more intimate statement of the inner life of Beethoven. And then the final movement, of course, the great rondo with the dance melody. It's just simply a marvelous piece of music. We'll be featuring violinist Maya Buchanan, a young, phenomenal violinist from the Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia, my alma mater, incidentally. And I'm very excited to be presenting Maya in this wonderful piece of music, which really did change the course of music composition for solo instrument and orchestra. The final piece on our program is Shostakovich's first symphony. Shostakovich would go on to write 15 symphonies, and in fact was one of, if not the greatest, of the 20th century symphonists. Shostakovich was very much molded by the world in which he lived. And though he wrote this piece as a senior project at the Petrograd Conservatory of Music, at the age of 19, which is in itself astonishing, he had lived a life filled with upheaval, with suffering, with intensity. And this comes to bear in this amazing piece. And so even though it's hard to imagine a 19-year-old writing a piece like this with its range from the first couple of movements, which are pokingly sarcastic and funny, and then the third and fourth movements, which are extremely wrenching and sad and powerful. As hard as it is to imagine a 19-year-old doing that, when one considers that Shostakovich lived through the 1917 revolution in Russia, he lived through periods of intense poverty, where literally there was no food to put on the table for weeks at a time. And also through the death of his father, which happened just a few years before he wrote this piece, one begins to understand how a young man could have this kind of life experience to produce such a magnificent and profound piece of art as the First Symphony. It's in 4 movements, which is rather standard. What is a little bit different is that the first 2 movements are substantially shorter than the last 2 movements. The first movement is, as I said, a little bit sarcastic, a little bit funny. Certainly, it seems like it's poking fun at military music or perhaps at militarism in general. And it has a very puckish theme, contrasted with a much more lyrical waltz theme that we'll hear first in the flute. The second movement is also extremely short, shorter even than the first movement. And in this movement, we have an extremely exciting, extremely fiery theme, which itself is then contrasted with a much more mellow, much more mysterious, and somewhat somber theme. The third movement is where this piece emotionally really begins to take off. And suddenly Shostakovich takes us into the world of his own deep sadness and inner feelings. Whether this is a reflection of the loss of his father or a reflection of the sorrows that he went through as a teenager, it really doesn't matter. What is important to understand is that suddenly this boyish composer that we heard in the first 2 movements has transformed into a mature and extremely expressive and profound composer of great music. The third movement begins with a tremendous oboe solo. It will also feature solos in the cello and also solos in the trumpet. And it really does take us into a different world of expression than we had in the earlier movements. And then finally, the last movement kind of brings this all together. And again, we have all of the elements from the previous movements, the intense expression of the third movement, the sarcasm and takeoff on military music that we had in the first movement, the excitement, the fire, the fast melodic content of the second movement, and he synthesizes this into a truly great finale, which ends in a dazzling way, as so much of Shostakovich's orchestral music does. This is the piece that put Shostakovich on the map. When he started writing this piece, he was a student at the Petrograd Conservatory, and when he finished writing this piece, it had been premiered already by the Leningrad Symphony, and he was suddenly thrust onto the international stage as a superstar. And he would go on to write some of the most memorable music of the 20th century. I think the people who come to this concert are in for a tremendous treat. Again, the concerts are January 27th and 28th at the Performing Arts Center at Greenwich High School. This will be featuring not just the Greenwich Symphony Orchestra, but violinist Maya Buchanan playing the Beethoven Violin Concerto. I hope you will be there. I think it's going to be a fabulous evening and afternoon.